Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be facing a challenge that may feel impossible. How to harmonise repeated notes that are going on at both the top of the texture and at the bottom. So just the same note going on, one note after another, at the top and at the bottom. Surely that is going to be the kiss of death to any piece of music and to any piece of harmony. It's a really interesting exercise to try and do though. It's one thing to have a repeated note at the top of the texture where the bass line can be moving off wherever you want to. It's something to be repeating a note in the bass. This is kind of using a kind of pedal point, but the other parts can wander about all over the place and you get plenty of variety. But if you limit yourself to repeated notes at both the top in the soprano part and at the bottom in the bass part, well, surely that kind of limits what you can do. Well, to some extent, that is true. But what I want to demonstrate in this video is that actually it's not really terminal. It's perfectly possible to do. And I'm not suggesting that everybody goes out and thinks, great, I'm going to write my first symphony and I'm just going to repeat the same note at the top all the way through the symphony and the same note at the bottom all the way through the symphony, because that could be a bit tedious. But what I do know is that lots of people are a bit fearful of repeated notes. Oh gosh, what do? I've got this repeated note. Do I just keep using the same chord? Well, no, you want to vary things a little bit. But is it possible to take this to a more extreme position and to have 4 bars, 4 measures, where you're repeating the same note at the top and the same note at the bass and still end up with harmony that's interesting enough to sustain those 4 bars or 4 measures? Well, I've got something on the screen now that is an attempt to do that. So have a listen and you can be the judge of whether we get away with that or not. Because do you see how many repeated notes we've got at the top and the bottom here? You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 at the top and the bottom. Gosh, that's quite a lot of repeated notes. This is what I came up with. F's repeated at the top, F's repeated at the bottom. Well, you might think, well, I wouldn't want to write a piece like that. In a way, I'm not sure I would. But hopefully you're kind of reasonably convinced that even though you can hear those F's going along the top and those F's going along at the bottom, actually it's possible to get enough variety in the harmony to make something interesting. One thing you're going to try and do is to think, well, if I'm static at the top and the bottom, maybe I need the middle parts to be more interesting. And one thing you might notice that I've tried to achieve here is to keep the middle parts kind of moving melodically, but I've also managed to run them in parallel intervals. So if I just take the alto and the tenor parts, you can see and hear that we're running in 6. So there's a bit of melodic interest even in the alto part. Goodness me, alto parts are often rather tedious really, because when you're writing good harmony, one piece of advice we see in many textbooks is keep your alto part using as many repeated common notes as possible. Keep the alto part sort of fairly static and that will stabilize the whole harmony. Well, that's fine, but if we're going to pin the top and the bottom to repeated notes, well, we've already stabilized it. So we need to bring the alto part to life a bit and the tenor part. So have a listen to the alto part on its own and hear that it's got a little bit of melodic shape and interest. Now you might think not the most exciting melody in the world, but actually it is a melody that you can follow and engage with. Listen to the tenor line. That's also got some melodic interest. It's got a little surprise about it as well, which we'll come back to in that third bar, that third measure. but actually as a pair of parts running along in 6. Sounds rather nice. And because there's enough interest there, we can cope with those repeated notes top and bottom. It's almost as if those repeated notes are pedal points top and bottom that are a little bit incidental to the melodic interest in the middle of the texture. Okay, well, let's have a sort of closer look at, well, what are we actually doing with all of this? So if we look at the first chord, well, harmonically, that's chord 1. That doesn't really surprise us. We're in the key of F major, starting on the tonic chord. Nothing surprising about that. Now, because I've got F, it's already worth thinking, if I'm going to repeat F, what are the chords that fit with F? Well, in F major, F is at the bottom of a chord 1, it's in the middle of chord 6, and it's at the top, the top of chord 4. So those are my options, 1, 4, 6. So it'd be worth just thinking, can we explore some of that stuff along the way? We'll see what other tricks we can pull out of the hat as well. So the next chord is chord 4. Now it just so happens, because you've got F in the bass, it's 4 in second inversion. Now that can be a little bit awkward dealing with second inversion chords. So you call that 4C or 4/6/4, wherever you kind of come from in the world and whichever system you're used to working with. Now we can kind of cope with having a second inversion as long as we're using something called a passing 6/4. Topic for another occasion, or we've got movement going on that goes 6/5, 4/3. Now, what do I mean by that? Over this repeated bass line, I've got the tenor a 6 above the F going to a 5th above the F. I've got the alto a 4th above the F going to a 3rd above the F. So this is a 6/4, 5/3 progression. So I'm going back to chord 1, but I'm doing this 6/4, 5/3 progression. So that's what those middle parts want to do. You can hear when I've got the second inversion, that 4th wants to go to this 3rd. You can hear it, can't you? Bomb is screaming to go down, and Yar is screaming to go down, and the tenor as well. So 6 pulls you down to 5, 4 pulls you down to 3. So that's a good thing to remember about using second inversion chords. Now, you might look at the next chord and think, well, what on earth is going on here? Well, there are different ways in which we could look at what's happening here, but I'm going to suggest this, that if we go on to the chord that follows, well, that's another chord 1. So really, this note in the alto is a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbour tone. And the same is true in the tenor, a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbour tone. So in other words, they don't particularly belong to the chord, but because I'm going in the alto part, A, G, A, you hear there's a slight dissonance there. All it's doing is acting as a lower neighbour tone or a lower auxiliary note. And the tenor, C, B flat, C, same thing's happening there. Now you could look at that chord and say, well, it's looking like a chord 2/7. So you could say, well, is this a 2/7 in its last inversion? Well, that's a possible way of looking at it. But actually, does it sound like that, or does it sound like you've got these lower neighbour tones or lower auxiliary notes? For me, it's a bit more in that direction. However, when you write something that works as passing notes, passing tones, or auxiliary notes, neighbour tones, and also happens to create another chord, well, in a way, that strengthens, that you can say, well, it sounds like this, or it sounds like that. It sounds like both. That's a good position in which to be. Okay, now, one thing that we've got a slight danger of in this harmonization is we could end up with an awful lot of crotchets or quarter notes. So one thing I've tried to do in the second bar, the second measure, is introduce a bit of rhythmic movement. I'm not overdoing it, but just enough to kind of vary things a little bit, which is why in the alto and the tenor, I've got these eighth notes, these quavers. It kind of gives the melody a little bit of rhythmic life, and it just kind of breaks the cycle of repeating on every single beat. So what's happening here? This is a passing note or a passing tone, and so is this. They're passing by step. In the alto, from A to C, you've just got B flat in between. In the tenor, from C to E, you've just got that D in between. Okay, so what's going on here? There's a funny looking chord on the second beat of the bar. Well, really, what we've got here is a 1-7. Now, you might think, 1-7? You know, is that okay? We might have met 5-7. We might have met 2-7. It's perfectly possible to have a seventh on any degree of the scale. It's true that if you're thinking about Baroque and classical period music, you're most likely to meet 5-7. You're secondly going to meet 2-7. After that, you will meet other seventh chords, but they're often in sequences and that kind of thing. As we move forwards though, well, you know, composers become freer in their use of seventh chords on any degree of the scale. So that's one way of just kind of sprucing things up, to go from a chord 1 and then add a seventh into it. It's just a nice bit of colour, isn't it? And then I'm coming back to this chord 4 that we used in the first measure, the first bar, in second inversion. And again, you can see that we're treating 6 going to 5, 4 going to 3. So I've got, again, this 6-4 going to 5-3. So it just makes those second inversion chords work well. And here I am back in chord 1. So we're using quite a bit of chord 1, but half the battle is, well, when can we use a different chord, like the chord 4s we've used so far? Is there anything I can do with chord 1 to just spruce it up a bit? Add the seventh, you know, you see what we're doing? Now, this is the point at which we're going to start feeling really stuck with this chord 1 thing, this F major thing. So now I'm trying to introduce a little bit of colour. And really what I'm doing here by using this E flat in the tenor part is to say, well, let's have a hint of another key. Now, if I use E flat, you're thinking immediately, well, I'm in F major. So if I add E flat to that, I'm in B flat major. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a neighbouring key, very obvious place to go. So I could have gone C, E flat, D natural. That would have been fine. And that would have been what we call a secondary dominant in B flat major. Okay, because the 1 is going to go 5 to 1 in B flat major, and the 1 in B flat major is also called 4 in the home key of F major. Now, actually what I've done is just something a little bit more colourful than that, because if there's a secondary dominant here, you hear the E flat, you expect it to go to B flat major. I'm now using a borrowed chord from the parallel minor. So instead of going 5-7 to 1 in B flat major, I'm going 5-7 to 1 in B flat minor. So instead of going E flat, D, I'm going E flat, D flat. So we end up borrowing a chord from the parallel minor of B flat major, B flat minor. So this is a 5-7. So this is a 5-7 in B flat, going to 1 in second inversion again in B flat, but B flat minor. Okay, so you see how that's giving us a bit of colour from that parallel minor. And of course, this chord is now a chord 4 in the home key of B flat major, except it's borrowed. So I've got chord 4 there with a flattened third, so it's borrowed from B flat minor. Okay, and then after all that, you might think, well, what am I doing here? As if that's not enough. I've got another one of these passing notes or passing tones in the alto and the tenor. So again, just giving us a bit of rhythmic movement. But you'll notice I could have done that rhythmic movement here. I could have put a B flat in there. I could have put a D in there. The reason I didn't is because that's exactly the same point in the bar, the measure that we did it earlier. So now I'm going to use it later in the bar, later in the measure, so it's just not entirely predictable. So I hope that makes sense. And then I'm going back to a little device we used at the end of bar 1, where you could say again that this is some kind of 2/7 last inversion, or you could say actually this is what we did at the end of the first bar. We treated this as a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbor tone, and we did the same thing in the tenor. But what I've now done is to delay the resolution of those notes into the last bar, because when you hear that at the end of bar 3, you're expecting it to go on to this straight away. So I'm just kind of milking that a little bit by repeating that and going. And you see, it just then melts into that final chord. So all of this stuff is just being extended over there to that first half of the last measure, the last bar, before we feel that final resolution back to the tonic chord called 1. So the harmony is not over complex, and you notice that I did say that that F fits with chord 6 as well, and I've managed to do all that without even referring to chord 6. We could have easily used chord 6 as well. No reason why we shouldn't do that, because there are actually other options beyond this. But I'm hoping you're sort of seeing, as we've analysed it, how I've tried to keep enough interest despite the repeated notes chiming away at the top and the bottom. Bit of melodic interest in the middle parts. Having the middle parts running in 6 or thirds, if that works, you know, that's quite nice. Having a bit of a mixture of chord tones and non-chord tones, or harmony notes and inessential notes. Having a little bit of rhythmic movement, you know, the same kind of figure coming more than once, but in a different place. So that just adds to it. Extending chords, a little touch of a 7th chord somewhere. Doing things with inversions, particularly the second inversions in this case, that often we say we have to handle with care. But if you get these 6/4/5/3 progressions, they're okay, aren't they? And effectively, in the last measure, sort of extending those notes that I've ringed at the end of the penultimate bar, but sort of treating them as suspensions, slightly unusual suspensions, because when you look at what's happening in the alto there and the tenor, they're not behaving as we normally go about suspensions. We've got an alto sort of doing a sort of 2/3 movement and a tenor doing a 4/5 movement. That's unusual in terms of suspensions, but you can see why I've done it. I'm just using those notes from the end of the previous bar. So enough interest in the rhythm, in the harmony, in the inessential notes and so on, that little borrowing from B flat minor. You've got enough interest across the 4 bars, the 4 measures, to kind of take us away from the tedium of the repeated notes top and bottom. So now we've analysed it, have a listen to it again. So I hope that gives you a bit of confidence in dealing with repeated notes. Well, if you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful, let me direct you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. And if you're really wanting to kind of zone in on your harmony, let me recommend that you click courses on the homepage and you go to our advanced theory course, which is really kind of going through the nuts and bolts of writing harmony, and or that you go to our keyboard harmony course, which is really taking you through a course in harmony at the keyboard and making this very practical, so you can kind of think this stuff under your fingers if you're a keyboard player, and even if you're not a keyboard player, just helping you to think very practically in 4 parts, and it will just increase your confidence and your fluency in writing and improvising, playing harmony. Lots of other stuff there as well. But have a look on those particular courses if you're wanting to take today's video a step further. www.mmcourses.co.uk